All right, I think we are ready to go. So thanks for joining us, everyone, in this first in a series of webinars about the science and control of odors. Our presenter today is the president of Tech Environmental and a NEBRA board member, Mike Lannan. Hi, Mike. Mike's a licensed professional. He's a licensed professional engineer with a BS in chemical engineering and an MS in environmental engineering from Northeastern University. He began his career working for CDM Smith back when it was Camp Dresser McKee for 10 years, and he's been with Tech Environmental since 2002. A little bit about Tech Environmental. It began operating in 1984. I'm going to mute everyone because somebody... So since its founding, Tech's trained thousands of regulators, operators, industry consultants on air and nuisance-related issues. They've trained local and state officials pretty much throughout New England and across the country. So we're very lucky at NEBRA to have a member with the expertise that Tech Environmental does, and it's my pleasure now to pass the presenter role to Mr. Mike Lannan. All right, so Mike will share his screen with us, and we will get going. Welcome, who is ever joining us. Mike Lannan from Tech Environmental. Just hang on, Mike, because you're on mute. All right.
Okay.
All right, Mike, I see your screen.
Great.
You're good to go.
Good. All right, here we go. Okay, great. And this is the first in a series of potential webinars that we could do related to odor. We thought it would be a good idea to kind of talk a little bit about this online in one of these join me / Zoom type meetings, given the current situation. And I wanted to dive right in. I've cut it into a number of modules. We could do one or all of them over time, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But this is number one. She just gave the background of we don't need to get into that right now. But we'll start right in on module one, odor. The outline for the science of odor module here is to talk a little bit about the sense of smell, what is odor, and why people complain, and why does it get worse. But you know, the first thing I think is to talk a little bit about some common misconceptions, and we see these quite a bit when we do odor training. When we do odor training for regulators, it typically is multiple days, and the first thing we often have to do is untrain them on some of the misconceptions. So first one is odor is subjective, so it cannot be discussed objectively. And that's really, with or without odor control, that's often what people feel initially. But that's just not the case. Odor is biological, so there cannot be accurate limits for it. That's another one that we address in a different module. The first one is really what we're focusing on today. Odors can be reasonably addressed reactively, only be addressed, reasonably in a reactive manner. Many rules and regulations are written nuisances as a reactive, but that doesn't mean that you can't address odor in a proactive manner. Odor complaints provide little to no benefit to the facility or operators, often looked at as extra things to do. Also, with respect to complaints, let me go back one second. With the odor complaints on here, regulators know that when they head out in the field, if they smell anything at all, therefore that's a confirmed complaint and therefore a potential nuisance or violation. And again, some of the things we have to unlearn before we move forward. From a control aspect, some of the misconceptions or odor control must eliminate odor. The primary focus of any odor control strategy should be on the odor control technology employed. Whenever you go to an odor conference, more than half of the sessions are on this technology or that technology or this technology used in this application. But the odor control focus is much more broad than that. Only certain odor control technologies are applicable to each situation. That's something that often people look at that and they say, well, biofiltration worked for me before, so I want to use biofiltration in this application. And if we're doing a facility-wide analysis, we often mix technologies on site for different reasons. On one particular site, you'll have more than one technology. So the best odor control option, often we hear from people, is the one I used successfully in the past. That's what I want to use. And we can stick with that, or we can move forward with other options as well. So possible additional modules here that we could talk about is what is an odor nuisance, odor limits, and what they mean. Odor limits versus health limits, which is an interesting one. Odor measurement techniques, odor response action plans, odor minimization versus odor capture. What are the ventilation needs, and then what are the requirements? Because those are two different things. Residual odor and dispersion, and then odor control technologies. And you'll see that odor control technologies is actually the last one on this list, because we really should have a background in all the others before we talk about that. So this one, again, we're from the science of odor. Obviously, the sense of smell is one of our 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, also known as olfaction. Like taste, it is a chemical sense. We have 4 receptors, taste buds. Smell, we have hundreds of receptors, about 396 to be more accurate. But that's plus or minus there, the way people look at that. 10% of inhaled air passes under the olfactory receptors, and 20% when we sniff. So when we do a sniff, we get a little bit more than we do when we're breathing normally. And then smell is 80% of the flavor during eating. So we often think of the flavor of food as being taste, but it's really a mixture of taste and smell. And there are millions upon millions of different scents. So sense of smell is the most complex of the human senses. We can detect 1 trillion distinct scents. Now, we can recognize up to about 1 million. So, a million, we can detect as something is there, but recognize and categorize and recall, it's about 1. We can smell fear and disgust, and each person has a unique odor themselves. Everybody has their very own unique odor. It's obviously, it comes out of a natural defense mechanism, and dogs have about 44 times more scent cells than humans and can actually sense illness. And it's not that dogs were provided more sense than humans. It's just humans over time have we could call it evolved or devolved, and we don't use it as much, so we don't have as many. Olfaction varies from person to person. About 1 in 20 lie outside the normal range. So 1 in 20 are either hypersensitive, above the range, or desensitized. Hypersomia or asnomia, which I always have trouble saying, are below the normal range. So the olfactory capabilities of many individuals, really probably hundreds if not thousands, and they vary from regulators to operators to other consultants to really the general public, and many are outside of the normal range, but don't even know it. Some people come in and they say, well, my spouse can smell much more than I can. So I know I'm on the low end. But some of them, they have such a low sense of smell that they're actually outside of the normal range. And why do we care about the normal range? Because really anybody in the normal range, even though their olfactory capabilities may be different on a person-to-person basis, can assess odors and respond to odor complaints. Now, asymptomatic or asomic means decrease. Okay, but the general interpretation is often lack of. So most people think of it as they have no sense of smell. But actually, what it is most of the time their sense is either impaired, damaged, diminished, weakened, not necessarily completely gone. So anyone in the normal range of sensitivity can assess odor nuisance potential with the right tools. Instrumentation can be the right tools, which we can talk about in another module. And then the human nose can be the tool. And often it's included in a combination of both. And again, in a different module, we'll get into the difference between odor limits that are total odor limits and odor limits that are compound specific. And we can talk about how we monitor those in a different one as well. So what is odor? One of the things odor regulations, odor discussions, and odor really evaluations is the words and the uses matter. And they matter mostly because people have very unique perspectives of what it means to be, what odor means to them. So odor versus smell, if we could talk about that for a minute. They're often used interchangeably. And the interesting thing is some people think of smell as short for smelly or offensive. Well, others think of it more positively, like the smell of fresh cut flowers or baked cookies. Oh, I love the smell of grandma's cookies, something like that. But some think of odor as fragrant, and then others as offensive. So, that perfume has a wonderful odor, okay? But others say, well, that landfill stinks. It's offensive, that odor. So it's interesting when we look at sort of what is the opposite of smelly. So if we look at that word, the opposite of smelly is perfume, sweet, fragrant, aromatic, savory. So, good smelling type things. So smelly is often sort of thought of as a negative. Again, when we're looking at a combination of both bad smells and good smells, that's often what people think of. They say, well, odor is bad, but aroma is good. And some suggest that odor and smell are related to the exposure pathway. So if you see the sketch of a nose and a mouth, the odor is coming in through the nose to get to the olfactory bulb, but the aroma, the coffee taste and aroma mixed together, or the wine taste and aroma, or cigars, or sake, or anything. And I have odor wheels for all of those different types of analyses they do. We could talk about it in a different session, but so some suggest that that's really the focus of the odor pathway, is how you are exposed to it. So what about odor versus smell? Well, and actually the smell is either the actual sense, the noun, the sense of smell, or the act of perception caused by the stimulated olfactory nerves. So that's the verb version. And odor is the property of a substance that activates the sense of smell. Okay, why is that important? Well, because often the word odor and odorant are used interchangeably. In this case, they're both nouns. And odor is the property of the substance that activates the sense of smell. Odorant is the actual chemical which stimulates the olfactory systems. So odor is actually the result of many odorants. There'll be dominant ones and subdominant, but typically it's a mixture because there are odors everywhere. Often when we talk about odor with regulators and training, they say, well, they have to get to the point where there's no odor. And then after we talk about this slide, I said, well, if odor is the property of a substance that activates the sense of smell, just about every compound activates it in some manner. So it's not, there is really no such thing as no odor.
Mm-hmm.
So when we get into sort of odor versus scent, okay? So odor is the distinct scent. It's the characteristic, the strong quality. So that's what makes it distinct from scent. So there's it's the characteristic. It's sort of the reputation. You know, sludges smell bad. They have a bad odor. Okay. Okay. Well, what does that mean? We don't say, well, follow that scent. Follow that scent of odor from the truck. You know, we just say that truck has a bad odor. We don't, you know, offer it to a dog and ask the dog to go down the street and track the truck. So there's a difference sort of between odor and scent as well. And why is any of this, or why is all of this sort of important? And I think you really have to start looking at the differences, especially because in regulations, these words are often used interchangeably, but they have different meanings to the regulators that write them, or the legislatures that write laws about them, or regulators that write rules or regulations about them. And it might not be as important, the differences, as much as really the overlap of individual interpretations of that. So the number one misconception here is that all of these labels talk about odor, smell, aroma, scent as a physical thing. So what is here? So actually mean when someone says you need to control that odor? You know, now that we've talked a little bit about what we just talked about, that's often what you'll hear at a public meeting. We need to control that odor. But now when we think of odor as this, you know, the ability of a substance to cause a reaction, you know, that's a little bit different than we need to remove H2S from the air. Those are two very different statements. So that's important to keep in mind. So to get a little bit more into it, I'd like to talk a little bit sort of about the brain function and olfaction. So the nose is hardwired to the brain. We obviously have different sections of the brain, and this is not going to get into the biology as much of the whole brain, as much as how does sort of olfaction differ from the other senses. So the emotional behavior is controlled by sort of the front of the brain, and that's the one that's closest to the sense of smell. So that's one factor that's different about the sense of smell versus our other senses, especially when you compare it to sight, right? When you think about sight, that's in the back of your brain. That's where all the thinking and planning goes on. So I've often used the example of someone driving down the street and looking at a billboard. And if they look at that billboard and see what it says, if it's logical to them, they don't really have an emotional reaction to it. It's just a billboard. But if there's something on it that is offensive in what it says, that triggers sort of the front of the brain. You're going outside of the thinking and the planning and looking at that, and you're getting into more of your emotional reaction to that. The difference is that you almost start with that, with odors. So, and then the other part of it is where smells are stored in the brain. The hippocampus is very connected to memory and recall. So it invokes the strong smell memories of, I like to use grandma's kitchen. So we look at it exactly where we're talking about. You can see smell is right here. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
You can? Okay. Smell is right here, the closest to the front of the brain. We've got vision in the back here. Taste is very close to this. Hearing is in this area and touch is here. So we've got the smell that's really down very close to this area where we're storing our memories and also where our emotional behaviors are. Okay, so that's the brain part of it. So the brain is then connected to the olfactory bulb here. All right, and then we have our olfactory nerves in this area, cilia, nasal cavity, and so on. The nerves here, down at the bottom, are connected up to the olfactory bulb. And remember what we talked about before is these olfactory nerves. There are, millions upon millions of actual nerves, but when we talk about odor receptors, there are only those. They make up those like 400 receptors, plus or minus. So why does that matter? Well, we need to think of olfactory nerves sort of as piano keys. There are only a few hundred receptors, but there are many, many different combinations of olfactory reactions or stimulation. So if we're comparing it to the piano, okay, the piano has 88 keys, okay, but how many infinite number of songs can come out, or melodies, or harmonies can come out of that piano with only those 88 keys? And that's kind of the way the nose works. So you breathe in, and you get enough of a whiff, enough concentration so that you can interact with a certain number of odor receptors in your nerve, and then your brain kicks in and says, oh, okay, well, when I flip these piano keys, then I smell this. So again, the analogy of piano, 2 eyes and 10 digits playing the piano, one can obviously not possibly visualize each keystroke as you're doing it. So in order to get better at the piano, you need to practice so that you improve your muscle memory. And how do you improve muscle memory? Well, you usually do it by practicing your scales or arpeggios so the fingers can remember where to find the keys. Okay? So the same holds true for olfactory perception and recognition. It is a physical and mental never mind. The perception varies by individuals. Okay, so here's a kid who really doesn't like to practice, and a kid who seems to enjoy practicing. So how does that affect what we're talking about here? Well, the key is that as you practice the piano, your muscle memory becomes more and more automatic. You can do your scales and your arpeggios in, just with muscle memory without really thinking about it. And that's very important when we're considering somebody who lives near a facility that may have an odor problem. You have a certain period of time, okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the time in a minute, but you have a certain period of time or duration and so on before somebody gets really good at recognizing those odors. And if that occurs, you need to have a different odor control strategy than you would if you're doing things in a more of a proactive manner. So how does the coronavirus affect our sense of smell? There's been a talk about people that have sort of experienced problems with odor because of, the coronavirus. It's doing damage to the cranial neural pathways. So they're pretty sure what's happening is it's between the nerves and the olfactory bulb, and that can be affected by inflammation, sort of the tissue surrounding the nerves, and it's like a lot of the effects of the coronavirus on people. It really comes down to people that had either hereditary or other issues before they got the coronavirus. And they're thinking that for the people that have the long-term damage to the neural pathways, they were predisposed for that, is the feeling there. And why is that? Well, it's affecting only certain groups of people. People that have milder cases, ironically, are the ones that are losing their sense of smell. And they think that has to do with some of the treatments that they're doing for people that are really, have to go on ventilators and stuff. They're really working to reduce the inflammation a lot more so than people that have the milder cases. So the good news is the olfactory nerves are the only nerves of our five senses that regenerate. So most people are seeing an improvement over time. Some just when the inflammation goes down, but also as the cells regenerate. And that's an important thing, because what really has made people nervous who have experienced a loss of smell due to the coronavirus is their other symptoms are going away before their sense of smell is returning in. And so some people are worried that it is going to be permanent. And it's unclear how many people will actually be permanently affected, but the majority are regenerating the nerve cells. The inflammation goes down and things are returning to a normal or a new normal with their olfactory senses. It would be really interesting if we were to be able to down the road retest some of the people that we've tested previously, and then if they've gotten the coronavirus, to see how much they have bounced back. But that's something we could talk about down the road. So back to what we're really talking about today. There are two thresholds for odorants or mixtures of odorants that we've been talking about. Remember, we talked about we can detect trillions of different odorants or odors, smells, but we can only recognize about 1 million. So either threshold can be the basis for odor regulations or limits, and have been, but the practical effect of how those regulations work should be different. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's driven more by politics than it is by the science of odor. So the odor detection threshold is the point where odor perception is just barely noticeable. So you basically are like, and you might sniff, you're like, I'm smelling something, but you don't know what it is. It's too faint to recognize it, or you don't have the ability to recognize that particular odor because it's not one of the ones that that you normally recognize. Now, that said, in most cases, as the concentration of an unknown odor increases, what ends up happening is we try to relate it to something we relate it to. So we're getting a mixed signal, but we relate it to something that might be erroneous, but it makes sense to us because we're starting to recognize some of the odorants by the composition of the odor receptors. So the odor detection threshold is really sort of limited to the ability to smell. So it's pretty constant over time for mild odors. It can become non-existent for stronger odors because of odor fatigue. So when we talk about odor sensitivity, there are two pathways of odor sensitivity. You can become desensitized, because you've been overwhelmed by too much hydrogen sulfide in a wet well area, for example. And then you can actually be exposed at toxic levels, or really at asphyxiant levels, and not know it, and that's a problem. But what I'm focusing on is the other side of sensitization, where sensitization actually can go down. And what do I mean by that? Well, the odor recognition threshold is the lowest concentration where the odor character can be determined. And then if the odor is not well known, it might need to be at a higher level in order to sort of recognize it. But even if it is known, it can become lower over time. For odors that are persistent or frequent, eventually the RT, the recognition threshold, begins to approach the DT. Well, what does that mean? Well, just visually, here's an example of some peak compounds in biosolids. On the bottom, we sort of have concentrations, and then they're related to their odor detection threshold on the left side. And you can see that this data is all over the place because it is with people that have varying degrees of odor sensitivity. But when you start looking at the R factor, there is clearly trends, and that's the important thing to remember, again, when we talk later about odor limits and so on. But the problem with the RT is if we consider that sort of the yellow line here is where the RT would start. So down at low concentrations, the RT is going to be less than the DT. It's always going to be less than the DT, which is the black line still. But as we practice our arpeggios and our scales in our nose by smelling the same odor over and over and over again, unfortunately what happens is our recognition line starts to come up more and more and more. So, okay, so what's the significance of that? A concentration above the DT could simply start to cause a positive sort of identification. So I believe I flipped my slide around. Excuse me. The higher. I'm sorry, my yellow one should be here and my red one should be up here. The red one should be very close to this line on the other side, and the yellow up here. That's my bad, because it doesn't match with the next slide. I'll have to change that when I send you the slides, Janine, so it's clear. I had this one in particular because it's a biosolids one, so I thought it was kind of fun to have a biosolids slide for the example in this case. But then I screwed up where the curves go. So anyway, so if you think of that curve the other way around now, where these lines are up, actually the red one would start to come down and approach the detection one. So why is that a problem? Well, at DT, all we know is we smell something. We're not learning anything. There's no memory stimulation. There's no judgment for hedonic tone. Hedonic tone is the relative pleasantness of the odor. How pleasant is it? There's two scales. One is 0 to 10. One is -10 to 10. We can get into that when we talk about measurements. But the point is that if you have something that is fairly unpleasant, and then you're evaluating that, you end up with a situation where you could end up really starting to learn that odor. So this is one of those situations that we often experience where when someone is complaining quite a bit or exposed to quite a bit to odor, they will say, after odor control improvements have been made, the odor is worse than it's ever been, okay? And we say, well, odor, if you're thinking of it as a thing, as the odorant, it's not. The number of odorants are lower because we've installed odor control, okay? But because the RT is approaching the DT, as the RT approaches the DT, there are more exposures, there's more stimulation of that sensory pathway. The perception increases. So the often the wastewater consultant will say, it's impossible that the odor is more because we've installed odor control. And in the context of odorants, they're absolutely correct. And then the neighbors say, well, but the odor is worse than it was before. And they are absolutely correct too. So we have to understand that nuance and understand how, once we've taught somebody how to do those arpeggios, it's automatic from then on. I think I just went over all this. Memory stimulation, lessons learned. So every time there's an RT stimulation, there's a lesson learned. And too many then can lead to nuisance conditions. So too many of what, though? Well, when we talk the potential for in brain function and olfaction, we often talk about our dog Fido. I changed the picture from our other dog to my cute pug because I thought it was fun. So Fido stands for frequency, intensity, duration, and offensiveness. So frequency is the number of events. Intensity is the strength of the odor. The duration is how long does this event or these events last, and how offensive is it? What is the reaction? What is the hedonic tone? Is it a negative? Is it a positive? And just because it's a positive, for example, worked on a clarifier project in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and although it was a fairly pleasant smell, it was dominated by the chocolate smell. The underlying smells were, the subdominant smells were the sulfur-based odorants. It was the chocolate smell that people called and complained about. So it doesn't always have to be what people would typically be considered offensive to be offensive if the frequency and the intensity and the duration are high. So why do people complain? Well, they obviously complain because it stinks. They also complain because they're worried about their health. Because once they smell something, they say, if I can smell it, it must be affecting it. Because remember, olfaction was a way to keep us safe many, many years ago. They're worried about the value of their homes. Most people have a lot of their equity in throughout their lives now invested in their homes, especially in the Northeast here. And it could decrease the value of those homes. So they are complaining about the odor and they don't like the odor, but they don't like the odor for a bunch of mental reasons as opposed to, remember, we're in that emotional area. They want respect because they think that you keep turning off the odor control switch. So they call and the odor control switch is turned back on and everything's better. Well, what really happened was the wind probably changed direction, or the dispersion characteristics were different, or something else happened. But often odor that is not continuous is fleeting. So calling and the odor changing, and there can be mental correlation with that, even if there isn't any reality. And oftentimes it's sort of, they feel like, the town or the city or the facility doesn't respect them. They're just there to make money, and they're not being respected about their own concerns. So again, the progression of the olfactory stimulation, as the RT is triggered over and over again, you get a whiff of something. You're like, hey, that smells a little bad. I don't know what it is. Then you start to get multiple times, and it starts to get a little bit annoying. And then you're saying, well, what is the long-term effect? Short-term effect, if I'm affected by this, what is the long-term effect? And then is it going to be toxic to me at any time? So that's sort of the normal progression. And why is that? When you look at sort of when people are impacting that sense, the switchboard in their brain in the front, in the emotional section, we get our stimulation, then start to get an emotional reaction. We start to have responses like calling and complaining. Then we start to get anxious about all those things that we're concerned about. And then we really start to get to a point where, well, I just need that odor to go away. It's got to go away immediately. It doesn't matter that it's not reasonable for it to go away entirely, or that it needs to go away entirely, or that it can happen immediately. But that's what we start to get into when we start getting into this practicing our odor arpeggios. So one thing I often have to remind operators when I'm doing operator training, if it's a wastewater treatment plant, a landfill, a coffee manufacturer, a varnish manufacturer, often, especially in the waste management and things, people are thinking of their goal as an operator is to satisfy all the regulations. And most of the regulations are related to solid waste. If it's a landfill, or if it's a transfer station. Most of the regulations are related to the NIPDs, if it's a water pollution control facility. But the problem is the public sees them all as interchangeably. And the senses are not always impacted by all three medias. I cannot remember the last time I got a call that said, I'm really annoyed by the possible exceedance of the NIPDs permit. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't affect their senses directly unless they see algae blooms in the river or something to that effect. But that's generally not the case. But the public sees this all as interchangeable. And oftentimes, one of the things we need to do is help facilities rewrite some of the operators' procedures so that odor control or air pollution control is actually one of the things that is part of their job description. So we talked a little bit about Fido, and the important thing to think about Fido for this module is it's not that there's one frequency that's the issue, or one strength that's the issue, or one duration. If we just look at sort of the intensity here, odor invent or intensity, the strength, and this is an intensity scale, it's not an odor DT scale. We can talk about that in another module too. And then we look at sort of the frequency of events per time. I used this slide, and we spoke about this slide with Maine DEP when they were having troubles with a particular facility that was experiencing a lot of biosolids odors. They actually had a regulatory response where they passed a law that said they had to write this odor reg. And they said, well, we just need the answer. We need the answer in the odor reg that allows us to say we address this concern. And in their mind, they're thinking of, for this facility, so politically this goes away. But from the facility operator's point of view, they were very concerned about one set of criteria because that's not necessarily going to address all the facilities and how they operate. Some facilities have neighbors closer to the fence line. Some have them further away. Some facilities have intermittent odors. Some have continuous odors. Some people have odors that vary in character throughout the day. Character from different cells in landfills. Older cells have different characteristics than newer cells. They have different persistent levels. So you need to sort of balance these things. So we actually came up with a multi-tiered recommendation for Maine DEP to deal with that, because the important thing here was they wanted something that was more like, well, if there's any sort of odor at all, then the facility is in violation. And all the other facilities have said that, well, that's not fair because that's not the definition of a nuisance. Okay, so we sort of talked a lot about this chart. And so if you do have a 3 or a 4 on this scale, and this is a log scale, this intensity scale, it's clearly, orders of magnitude above detectable. So if you get to that level, okay, one or a handful of events could be considered a nuisance. However, if it's a very mild odor and it doesn't really affect somebody directly, and we'll talk about what that means when we talk about the nuisance one a little bit more in that module. But just for this level here, because we're about out of time and I want to have some time for some questions, you can see that it might be that if you have a odor that's very close to the detection level, all right, we won't have any issues for a long period of time. You could have multiple events and it wouldn't really be a nuisance necessarily. You could be a good neighbor and be detectable as long as you're not strongly recognizable. And that's the important point here. And the last slide I have is a picture of a wastewater treatment plant, and it's in a small harbor town in Connecticut. And this facility had very little odor control, and for many, many years functioned under the philosophy of, well, it's a wastewater treatment plant. What do you expect? And over time, during the last real estate boom, a number of people moved in nearby. The locals referred to them as 212s, folks from New York City who would come out on the weekends, and they really drove up the value of the properties around this facility. And over that time frame, there was little done to reduce odor. So by the time we were involved in the project, the RT and the DT were so close together that people were already in this very high anxiety mode. And the only possible solution was to cover and treat every part of the facility. So every part of this facility, from influent through chlorine contact chambers, was covered and treated and sent to odor control. And luckily, this facility was small enough where that could be done at a pretty reasonable level. But had the odor control been added before there was this anxiety level, before there was this olfaction, brain activity occurring, they could have very likely just covered some of the major sources, and a lot of the aeration basins, for example, smell a lot like the low tide. So would there have been a concern there? Probably not. But the pendulum had swung so far into the anxiety mode, the only politically successful solution was to cover and treat the entire facility. So that's basically the end of this module. And like I said, we can talk about more of this in different modules, but I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions. So
thanks, Mike. I've unmuted everyone, but I do have a couple of questions to get going here. Here's an interesting one. Can or do odors get forgotten? Does the mind forget odors at all?
Unfortunately, it's a lot like riding a bike. Okay, you might be a little wobbly, but you have stored these memories, especially older memories, are stored. As we get older, I know I get more forgetful. So there is a discussion of older people having a higher tolerance for frequent events, but in general, you do not forget them.
Very interesting. And somebody actually wanted you to go over again where you talked about, even once you've addressed the odorants and taken those out, how it's still being detected by the neighbors after it's been addressed. Can you maybe go over that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
it's
not
sort
sure
of
I
related
understand.
to this science. So
Is it in the chat or?
Yep, it's
I don't
in
know
the chat, but whoever asked the question can maybe shout it out again. I think they just wanted you to go over that slide again. It was where the RT and the DT come together, and you had mentioned.
Oh, the one where I had upside down?
Yeah. Well, that's where you were mentioning about people still complaining after you've addressed the odors. And I think they just want you to go over it again.
This one here?
Yeah. It was around this time where you mentioned about you've gone in and done odor control, and after it's done, you're still getting complaints.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, all right. What I was talking about there is essentially where we're about at this point here. So the key is that when you what happens is that the odor threshold for individuals before they recognize it goes down over time. Okay, so that even milder odors that they associate with the wastewater treatment plant. And we saw this in 2 or 3 facilities, one of them being in Pittsburgh, one was in Salem, Mass. And it doesn't matter where the other, well, down in Collier County, Florida, I think, where we saw that the complaints started to, if we look at the correlation between odor complaints, and now I'm talking on a total odor basis, initially and over time, we often use a threshold depending on the neighborhood and depending on the situation, if it's a commercial area or an industrial area, or it's a residential neighborhood area, or it's an area that has schools. So you have all sorts of different thresholds within there. But in general, if you have an odor that's between 5 and 15 DT, that's the detection threshold, okay? Between 5 and 15 initially, before people are sensitized to odor, that's sort of the threshold where people might call and complain if that occurs on a regular basis, okay? In Pittsburgh, at the Alcosan treatment plant, we went over thousands of odor complaints, and it was a unique situation where the neighborhood was elevated above the wastewater treatment plant by a fairly large hill, as you know, in Pittsburgh, a very hilly area. And they were also in the dominant downwind direction. So the area sources will tend to follow the odors up the hill and then impact the neighborhood. Unfortunately, because they're going uphill, they have very little vertical dilution. So there were often times where odor was detectable in the neighborhood. And in that particular case, we found that the odor DT threshold for nuisances, DT now, not RT, dropped from that typical 5 to 15 down to 2 to 4, and very close to 2 over a long period of time, because this was years and years and years of data that we analyzed. And we went back and looked at when they complained and how it lined up with different weather conditions. So what ends up happening there is, what happened was the RT was initially in that 5 to 15 range, but then it dropped down to the 2 to 4 range, which is very close to the detectable threshold. Now, in theory, 1 to 1, is a undiluted source, and that is the concentration at which you would be able to detect it. But the reality is because you're outside in the neighborhood, in the environment, there are lots of people that actually are experiencing other natural background odors that are there. So the actual threshold for someone to recognize or even detect something in the field is not a 1 to 1 DT, but it's in the 2 to 5 range. So because these people had learned it, they essentially were in the range where their detection threshold and their recognition threshold were almost on top of each other. So if hypothetically the facility had done something to reduce the odor level that was originally 15 to 30, 100 times a year, down to 5 to 10, 100 times a year. Actually, more than that, because when you drop it down, it actually becomes more frequent, typically. They actually are experiencing the odor in a way that they can recognize it more in the future than they were in the past, even though the odor control has gotten better. I hope that explains it.
Yeah, no, and that was where they were going. They wanted to understand why people. It's really it's a part of that emotional brain thing. I think is they sense it as worse because it's
right.
closer to that DT. Very interesting, Mike. Are there any other questions from any of the attendees? I have unmuted you if you would like to ask Mike a question before we wrap up. Oh.
Well, we don't have, it's okay, Jeannie. We don't, when we get to things like measurements and technologies, everybody has lots of questions. Nobody cares about odor in the brain, really. It's just background we need before we move to other things.
But I appreciate your presenting it in such a way, Mike. I love the analogies with the piano and practicing our scales. And thank you for reminding us all that the nose is connected to the emotional part of the brain, and any of us working in the field are very aware of that. But now we know the science behind it. Thank you. All right, so I think that's it, everyone. I'd like to really thank Mike and Tech Environmental for sharing your expertise with us at NEBRA. The session's been recorded, and early next week we'll send a copy of the recording and the slide deck to all of you who are in attendance. So if you have any suggestions for future webinars, please send those along as well. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. I'll take my presenter role back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day, everyone.